a lot of people have trouble with definitions. So I think the best place to start would be, let's define consciousness, the self, and the soul. What are your definitions of these concepts?
That's going to cause some trouble. Yeah, we start there, but also, of course, it's what the whole of our quest is about, is actually trying to reach definitions which we can translate into both biology and into psychology. The self, the soul, and consciousness. Well, I mean, clearly it's kind of nested hierarchy. I can't imagine a soul which didn't depend on a self, and I can't imagine a self which didn't depend on consciousness. But consciousness it's a hybrid concept, and it causes a lot of problems. Some people have just a very, I think, rather, let's put it, a rather reductionist view of what consciousness means. It's simply a kind of information processing in which we happen to have access as information processors to the techniques and the content of what we're doing. In other words, we have introspective access. Now, that's an essential part of consciousness, knowing oneself, being able to report on states of mind and so on. But it's not that difficult to imagine how to create that kind of setup in a machine or in a biological system. And the thing is that you could have all that, and it wouldn't be conscious in the other sense, which is what really matters to us. And sometimes we call that phenomenal consciousness, the consciousness of sensations, the quality of experience, the redness of a poppy or the saltiness of the sea. Those sensations which are so natural and familiar to us, but which actually seem to be totally detached from physical reality. That's the hard problem, as David Chalmers has said, of trying to explain how the quality of consciousness can arise out of a material brain. And that's what, over the last 50 years, really, I've been working on. I mean, I moved from earlier kinds of consciousness to do more with introspection and trying to understand those kind of cognitive processes, but increasingly became hooked on the problem of sensation, of qualia, and of what it is which produces that magical experience.
I think the qualia is the most, I would say, the biggest part of the debate. I mean, this phenomenal consciousness, and how is it possible that we can have this ineffable experience?
Devin, it's interesting you say it. You're absolutely right. And everybody says that. And when it comes to it, they then go and work on some other problem. You see most work on consciousness, under that name anyway, is actually to do with the easy problems. It's to do with attention and memory and it's the difference between sleep and waking and so on, all of which have to do with the question of the workspace in our brain, which we can access through consciousness. So I've actually, I'm very insistent on making that distinction. I actually say that consciousness, we should talk either of cognitive consciousness or of phenomenal consciousness. Mm-hmm. Most people, when they say they're talking about phenomenal consciousness, are actually talking about cognitive consciousness. And none of the work they're doing or the results they get have any bearing on explaining the qualitative nature of the experience. You'll see it, very good, and the best people, Anil Seth, do you know him?
Yes.
Maybe you're going to interview him in Great Britain. Just written a wonderful new book on consciousness. But
yes,
I think he acknowledges.
Ready to read it. I'm actually very excited for that book.
Well, I haven't read it yet. It hasn't quite come out. But I know him very well, and I know how good it'll be. But Anil doesn't pretend that he's solving the hard problem. Other people, surprisingly, like Tononi in the United States and Christoph Koch and others, who are fascinated now by what they call integrated information theory. They are talking about information processing, and they suddenly slip into thinking they're talking about something which is generating the qualitative nature of our experience. And so they say they're working on the hard problem. Well, in fact, they're working on a side problem, at least as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, I mean, if for integrated information theory, it's almost like taking a panpsychist view. You're pretty much starting with consciousness being a fundamental entity of the universe moving upward. So you've not necessarily
end up with
the hard problem.
You end up with a theory which isn't actually a theory. It's a theory without a subject. Yeah. I mean, the problem about integrated information theory is, if it, I don't think it makes any sense anyway, but even if it did, it leaves consciousness completely free floating. It hasn't got a kind of core, it hasn't got a focal point, which actually becomes the node around which everything else happens. So I think it's a sham.
Yeah, I like that you brought up Anil Seth, because he does do some fascinating work. The way he describes it, he describes consciousness. He's not the first person to do this, by the way, but he describes it as a controlled hallucination, and
Yes.
and a lot of his work aligns very well with sort of the illusionist theories of consciousness. But I don't think he particularly does consider consciousness to be an illusory experience.
No, I don't. I think we must be careful again with that word illusion, because that's recently come back into use in theories about consciousness. But to me, how is it that we have the idea that our experience is immaterial and unconnected with physical matter? That's the sense in which Dan Dennett and Keith Frankish and I have used that term illusion, that we somehow get the sense that we are in the presence of something which is unreal and inexplicable, kind of magic. I've often drawn the analogy between looking at the impossible triangle, which you can, sometimes called the Penrose triangle, which can actually be constructed out of wood as an actual real object. And when you look at it, you see something which couldn't exist. Now that's one kind of illusion, and it's in some sense, I mean, of course, it has to be an illusion. The brain doesn't contain things which aren't possible. But what has interested Keith and me and Dan, for that matter, is why we should bother generating something which in fact is in some sense completely imaginary. Now it's imaginary in just in that one very special sense that it couldn't exist. The kind of illusion which I think Anil Seth is talking about, I think you're referring to, especially when you talk about schizophrenia, or it might be dreams or whatever. You have the experience of living in an unreal world, but it's a possible world. It's not a world which couldn't exist.
It's pretty much an hallucination that aligns well with the actual sensory stimulus that's coming in. That's all. Because once someone gets slightly out of touch with that experience, that's when it becomes an uncontrolled hallucination.
Yes, but it's a hallucination. I mean, it can even be a hallucination of something which, a unicorn or whatever it may be, an entity which couldn't or doesn't exist. But it would be a possible. I mean, a possible animal to have.
A lot of people talk about when, for example, if you're staring at a bright light and then you close your eyes, there is that almost that remnant of redness that lingers beneath your eye. Like, where is that? That is not really occurring anywhere in space. So that must be within the brain, must be constructed. And I think that's where he kind of goes with it.
Yes, I agree. I mean, but there's afterglows or phosphenes. I think we locate them. We locate them in the visual field, for example. That's where they are. They're not free floating. And I think they are, in fact, they are sensations, which they're sensations of what's happening at the back of our eyes. Again, there's nothing particularly magic about that. I mean, it's, they're strange and wonderful and interesting, and they don't necessarily correspond to the reality out there. You're experiencing something on a retina which hasn't actually been generated by a light in the environment. So that's a mistake. And in that sense, I've drawn the distinction between an illusion, let's say, of a stick in water, which looks bent. Yes. Now, it's an illusion. It isn't really bent, but it could be bent. It's not you're not perceiving something which, in principle, couldn't be there. The question of what it's like to experience qualia, the sensations of red or pain or sweetness or whatever it may be, I think raise very different questions. The question of why we should think we're in the presence of something which, in some sense, real sense, couldn't really exist. Now, that's what fascinates Keith Frankish, I think, and he and I don't see entirely eye to eye on these issues anymore. We did in the past, but I've actually tried to pull away from illusionism.
I actually brought that up with Keith. I asked Keith about the fact that in recent years, your view is slightly shifted. So what he
Mhm,
said was that, and you'll probably see the episode when it comes out. He says that he
mhm.
still believes that in Seeing Red, which I mean, I've read all your books. In Seeing Red, your views were very much aligned with Keats, and he believes that
Mhm.
later on you slowly, because I know now you call it phenomenal surrealism. You want to actually refer to this
Well,
as better than an illusion. This is something we've crafted and created. I mean, and it's magical. It's art. It's
yes, and
distinctive.
the reason I don't want to say it's an illusion is because I think it's in one sense it is real, but it's a real property of sensations. And what sensations are they're telling us how we feel about what's happening to us.
Mhm.
And feelings can have all sorts of interesting and miraculous properties. Feelings don't have to be tied to physical reality. They can have whatever properties nature has decided to instill in them in order to give us the impressions we have. The question is, why should it, what's the payoff of having feelings about things, in particular feelings about sensory events, what's happening in our skin or our eyes or our ears? Why we should think that the way we're relating to what's happening out there should have this strange and extraordinary dimension to it.
I'm
And
not sure. Are you familiar with the work done by Mark Solms? He's a
I,
professor.
I know Mark a bit, yes. Yeah.
So he's written a new book on consciousness. It's called The Hidden Spring, and
Mhm.
pretty much talks about almost exactly aligned with what you're saying right now. He talks about consciousness being more of an effective response. It starts with a
Mhm.
very basic aspect of feeling. I mean, I've got the book. I haven't yet read it, but I'm very excited to read it because he's pretty much touching on what you're touching on right now. He believes it is a fundamental feeling of experience rather than something that was created and rationalized with the cortex or the later parts of the brain. What do you
Yes, I know, but he and I actually, we had a big fight about this last year. Maybe it was 2 years ago. Time goes so fast at the international, no, towards the Science of Consciousness conference,
Was it with
because
you and Mark?
with Mark, yes,
Okay.
Mark thinks it's all occurring in the old brain and then in the lower part of the brain. I think just the opposite. Mark thinks this kind of experience is terribly primitive. It's the experience, of frogs and fishes and embryos and children whose cortex has been destroyed. He thinks they're still having sensations of that sort. I think absolutely the other way around. I think sensations are of the kind we experience a very late development. I think we're very privileged to have them. I don't think most animals have them. I'm quite certain that babies with no cortex don't have them. So it's, although Mark and I converge in one way, that we're both interested in the qualitative nature of experience, he thinks of it as primitive, and I think of it as very sophisticated.
Yeah.
And the
It's
reason
funny enough,
partly
your Mark's book, The Hidden Spring, it was right next to your row of books on my bookshelf. As I ran to grab it on the way to do the interview, I thought I was grabbing Soul Dust, but it seems that I grabbed Soul Searching instead. Either way,
uh-huh.
while we're on this topic, tell me about the soul. How do you think, what is the soul? And why do people talk about the soul still in the 21st century? Why are we still discussing this?
Well, the soul is a construct. It's something we've invented in our linguistic culture, and with all the baggage which goes with the kind of discussion, the religion, and everything else, which informs our notion of what it is to be a human being. I think religion has, in a sense, hijacked the self and turned it into the soul. But nonetheless, I mean, I use the term soul, but always without any religious context to it. I think the soul is based on our sense of where we belong, what kind of being we are, where we fit into the nature, and where we fit in relation to other human beings. I've actually said that I think that there is it's very adaptive to think of ourselves as being as special as we do, as having this immaterial, wonderful quality to us, which can't be pinned down and turned back into a reductionist, a simple composition. I've even said that I think that we've evolved to live in what I've called the soul niche, the ecological niche, which is where we belong in the world, where the most central thing in our lives is the sense that we walk around surrounded by other human souls and relate to them and think about them and worry about them and engage with them at a level which of course isn't going on in any other animal. But to humans is absolutely central. I've said that, for example, I mean, trout live in rivers and bed bugs live in beds. Humans live in soul land. And soul land is the territory of the spirit, and it's become absolutely central to the whole of the development of human culture, human civilization. But it is a linguistic, social, philosophical construct. At the bottom of it is just our self as sensory experiences as individuals who, in a way which we are, I mean, since it's an extraordinarily lonely and privileged place to be, because so far as we know, we're the only conscious selves in the world. That's how we begin anyway. We have no direct experience of other people having the same kind of access to this miracle of nature, which we ourselves take for granted as almost defining who we are and what we care about. So that's at the base of it. We wake up, and in the first few months of our lives, we find we've entered into this magical universe dominated by sensations. We slowly begin to recognize that it's not just us. Almost certainly, though it's still a guess, it's true of our mother and our brothers and our friends and so on. And then we begin to extend the circle and assume that other creatures, even beyond human beings, have the same kind of spiritual center to their lives. But that's largely guesswork. And it's, of course, some philosophers would say it's illegitimate guesswork. All we really know is about our first person experience. Nonetheless, it's, we couldn't live in a world in which we really believed we were the only souls or the only selves alive. It'd be too lonely and too depressing. So luckily we can convince ourselves that we're not alone. And I think we can say that conjecture is almost certainly valid, even if it's not defensible in terms of logic or empirical demonstration. So to come back to that, we begin with a self which is created by sensation. We see how extraordinary, feel how extraordinary it is. It gives us a sense of ourselves as living almost independently of our bodies. We believe that our self survives sleep and can survive anesthetics and can even, let's say, survive death. And that becomes the central tenet of our lives. We've got something which we hold on to, a ball to keep in the air. We want to keep this up and we want to take it forward with us. We are very ambitious for ourselves. Okay, but it begins with sensations. And as I see it, natural selection, we're all the product of evolution, has given us this sense of ourself precisely in order to make us have grandiose ideas about what we are and what we can be. And that's what's become it's driven humans to the glories, but also some of the excesses which we're so familiar with. Now, in writing a book, several books now, but I'm writing yet another book about the nature of sentience and how this begins in other animals other than human beings. I mean, it's all very well to say this nature has given this kind of experience to us as humans, but as an evolutionist, that means that we must know how it got there, where it came from. It didn't suddenly spring up with human beings, 200,000 years ago. So clearly animals must have selves which are rather like ours, although they may not be quite so elaborate, they may not have quite the qualities which ours have. But selves must have been valuable to animals long before they could talk about them or even have the kind of rather grand ideas which I've just been discussing. Animals can't think of themselves as souls. So what is it about the self of an animal? Why would it be so important that it should have this other magical, strange qualitative dimension to it, if it does? And so I've been arguing just in this new book I'm writing that actually, yes, we can take it back, but lower than human soul, to what I'd call the phenomenal self. And the phenomenal self is this is what we find when we look in on ourselves and wonder, who is here? Who am I? Where do I belong in the world? And it becomes, even for an animal, the center of its thoughts and its ambitions and its history. Even my dog figures in this book because I need to take it back from humans, but not too far back from humans. So I discuss whether or not what the dog idea he has of himself. I'm quite certain he is phenomenally conscious, though I should again qualify that by saying, well, yes, quite certain, but yes, but still I can't prove it. Nonetheless, everything about him tells me he's phenomenally conscious. For example, the fact he enjoys life so much. He spends so much time actually feeding his consciousness. I call it qualia-philia. And if you ever want an example of a qualiophile, it would be my dog, Bernie. He lives for sensations. But it's more than that. I'm quite certain that when he thinks, where was I today? Or where am I going to be tomorrow? The I of that, and I'm sure he has a sense of an I, is he's saying, where is my sensory self going to be? Where am I going to be taking this sphere of experience which I carry around with me? I think we can take it back at least to dogs, and even earlier than that.
When a human does that, let's say when a human considers themselves and they're thinking about themselves, talking about themselves, how do you think they then try and figure out how it's possible that there is a self now talking about another self within them? How do they reconcile this sort of double self?
Well, I don't think it is a double self. I mean, Dan Dennett, I think, said something very sensible about that a long time ago. He said, well, how is it that I know all these things about myself? And he said, that's because that's what it is to be an I. That's its job, is to know things about oneself. It wouldn't have any meaning otherwise. So it's not a puzzle. It's almost a tautology that I know what it's like to be me, because that is what it is to be an I. And if and when we...
I think that he talks about that in the multiple drafts theory. And he looks at the stance. But he also wrote a book with Douglas Hofstadter. I think it was called The Mind's Eye. And I know you also work with some of, well, you discuss the strange loops and these attractor states. Let's try and run through that a little bit and how that relates to our experience of self and consciousness.
Well, I borrow from Doug. Yes, I mean he an idea, but it wasn't actually. I don't think he was using it in the same sense that I was. I actually, in trying to think, well, what's happened in the brain which could possibly be responsible for us representing it as having these strange qualities. I mean, in the end, all there is going on in the brain is neural activity. And it turns out that we represent that as the world of experience, but not as the kind of world you'd expect. We certainly don't have a picture of our minds as being full of brain cells or having all the physiological properties which they do. No, we experience it in terms of these strange and rather mysterious conscious experiences. So I wanted a model for what kind of process could be going on in the brain which would generate or have the potential for generating all the strange qualities which we emerge and which emerge in our minds. And in sense, it's almost been, I make it too easy. I say, well, what's I think is happening is that the circuits in our brain are developing attractor states. That means mathematical states, which, because of the self-reflexive qualities of the brain, that the loops which are generated, they can create stable patterns, which have very extraordinary qualities. Mathematicians realize that these attractors, mathematical objects in a way, can have an infinite number of dimensions to them. So they're not like brains, which can only have 3 or 4 dimensions to them at most. But what if we are generating mathematical products within our minds, which we can then observe and access and in a direct way begin to explore properties. that's and there's lots of models, of course, for self-reflective loops of that sort. The simplest level, when we can talk about the wonderful drawings of Max Escher, for example, which I'm sure lots of your viewers are going to be familiar with, the impossible figures which Escher developed by developing structures which in a sense, are recursive, which catch their own tails. His wonderful staircase, which you go up climbing. Sorry?
I said, and another great example you use is that of an orchestra and a microphone picking up the loop, and then it continuously getting louder and louder each time.
Yeah, that's at the very most simplest level. But let's now, when it comes to Doug Hofstadter's ideas, he's now taking it up a few notches from that, but in a sense, it's the same idea. These strange loops, which are mathematical loops, they're not, I mean, we have to use terms like loop to discuss them, but they're not like loops of string. They're loops of information catching and reflecting itself and catching onto its own properties, and by then generating hyper properties. I think it's a good way to go. I mean, it's of course a bit of a cheat to say that what we're representing when we experience the color red or whatever it is a mathematical object being generated in our brain, because people say, yeah, give me the equation or whatever it may be, which at the moment we can't even begin to do. But what I've tried to do, and particularly in developing that idea, is to say, okay, we don't know the answers yet, but here's the kind of thing which might do it. Once we liberate our thinking to say, okay, we're not now having to think about action potentials in nerve cells. We can think about the qualities of the structures which could be being generated by dynamic activity in the brain. So, and again, I stuck my neck out. I've said that when we represent our experience as being like something, there is something which we're representing as being that, and it's a real thing. It's something in our brain which has those properties. I've said there must be something like in order to generate phenomenal properties, we have to have something like a phenomenous object, something which, when we observe it, will appear to have those phenomenal properties. And we mustn't be shy of naming it. And saying that that's where what we should be looking for in the brain, because we need something as peculiar as that in order to give us the scope then to understand how it could be generating experience. So it takes me far away from most of the neurophysiologists and others who, originally I hung out with, people like Christoph Koch, who think we can find a particular bit of the parietal cortex, whatever it is, whose nerve cell firings are going to be the neural correlate of consciousness. That won't do. You're not going to find anything big enough and grand enough if you're just looking at the level of nerve cell activity. We have to be thinking about the structural properties of the that are being generated by these recurrent loops. So yeah, that goes back to Doug. We're all in this game together. I've just he and Dan Dennett and I and others spend a lot of time fighting each other. I've just written a piece, in fact, actually it's the last words of the book I've just written, which is that students of consciousness have to have a sense of humor. They have to be able to take the rough with the smooth, and to not kind of think that this everything comes to a stop because he or she can't agree with me.
I know Dennett has always was someone you greatly looked up to in the philosophical community, because you started out doing a very diverse work. I mean, you worked in psychology, you also worked with primates, and you've done some fascinating work on that. I think actually before we discuss Dennett, let's talk about that. When you spoke earlier about animals having these conscious qualities, let's look at a primate and try and compare the type of conscious qualities or phenomena that occurs within a primate. A monkey, chimpanzee, bonobos are actually very close to us genetically. What type of resemblances do you see between those species and us?
I think there no, not identical, but they're pretty close. What they lack is language, of course, and language is not unimportant. I didn't say that. Language can change everything. Well, not quite everything, but so what humans can think about their experience and share it and discuss it and build up concepts which can't even in any way enter the minds of a bonobo or chimpanzee. So I think, but to come back to the level of sensory experience, I've no doubt at all that bonobos have sensations which have that qualitative dimension to them, which we find so precious. I've no doubt that dogs do. I think that rats probably do. I don't think that frogs do. I don't think that fish do. And if you want to know, I don't think that octopuses do either. I think that sentience of this kind I'm talking about, phenomenal experience, is a relatively late comer in evolution. But it's certainly present in the higher primates. Another question you could have, I think you were going to come to me on about was, well, I mean, I've not worked, but I've had the privilege to study with Dian Fossey in Rwanda and actually observe wild gorillas, for example. But my main work with primates was actually at a very different level, and one which lots of people would probably be uncomfortable with. I was studying the brains of monkeys, looking at what happens when you take away part of the sensory brain, for example. And I was extraordinarily lucky as a research student to have a major breakthrough in what was coming to, falling out in front of my eyes. I worked with a single monkey. She was called Helen, who had the visual cortex at the back of her brain removed, not by me, I should say, but by Professor Weiskrantz in the Cambridge lab. Helen was blind, so far as we could see. Weiskrantz was kind of, that's what he expected, and he wanted to confirm that the visual cortex is crucial to vision. So, okay, he confirmed it. Helen, told, so far as any of us could tell immediately, could no longer have any visual experience, and certainly couldn't use it. I had reasons to think this mightn't be entirely true. And the reason was that I had also been doing some separate work recording from single cells in the monkey brain, not in the visual cortex, but in the old part of the brain, in the superior colliculus, what's equivalent to the optic tectum of a reptile or a fish. It lies beneath the cortex, but it has a big input from the eyes. And what I found is that, in fact, there were cells in the visual cortex of monkeys which have very fine properties, very small receptive fields, sensitivity to movement, and so on. So it seemed to me that after removing the visual cortex, which would leave intact the old optic tectum in the brain, a monkey might still be able to see, and she might, in fact, be able to see rather like a frog does. I mean, she's still got the frog's brain. And in fact, a paper I wrote later was called What the Monkey's Eye. So what's the frog's brain tells the monkey's eye. So anyway, so I thought that there might be more to the story than Weiskrantz was saying, and in fact that and other physiologists had seen in studying the visual cortex. And I had a bit of luck. Larry Weiskrantz went off to a conference in Basel. I had some time on my hands, and I thought, okay, I'm going to come and check this out. And I spent the next few days sitting with his monkey, playing with her, watching what she did, trying in every way to coax her into perhaps demonstrating that she could see more than anybody had yet realized. And actually it became very obvious, I won't even say within days, within hours, that she actually did have a residual capacity for vision, not perfect, of course, at all, but enough to make her look in the direction when I held up a piece of apple, for example, and waved it in front of her eyes. She'd looked for it. She was soon reaching out with her hand to take it. This was a monkey who, for a year, she'd been there after the operation, had been completely depressed, sitting there, not bothering to look around, basically waiting for the, waiting for. I'm just distracted because my dogs jumped up at the door. I must have heard us talking. Anyway, so Helen was a despondent, sad animal. Within a couple of days, she'd taken on a new lease of life, apparently because she was beginning to be able to see again. So I sent a telegram to Larry Weisskranz in Basel, didn't have email in those days. It said, Larry, stop, you won't believe it. I've taught Helen to see. He came back a week later, not in terribly good mood. I said, look, Larry, come on, you've got to come and see this. And he said, yeah, when I've got time. A few days later, okay, finally, he came to sit with me with his monkey and to observe that Helen was now looking at things, reaching for them, apparently interested in the visible world again. Cut a long story short, I mean, within a month, we'd written a paper for Nature about vision in a monkey without striate cortex. And out of that, developed 7 years' work on which I basically adopted that animal and worked with her and took her with me wherever I went, and generally tried to continue this process of physical education. Not that difficult. She proved once she got interested, she was going to relearn how to use her eyes. She went with me to Oxford. She came back to Cambridge. I would take her for walks around the village and the department outside Cambridge. Couldn't do that now, I'm afraid. Health and safety wouldn't allow it. But anyway, in those days you could. And there'd been this extraordinary transformation. Question was,
do you think the brain of you said it's Helen, right?
Helen, yes.
Do you think her brain basically did what we now call neuroplasticity? I mean, some parts of the cortex that was left over started to compensate for what was lacking. I'm not sure if you've some David Eagleman's work with sensory substitution and how we can relearn certain things using.
Yeah, I don't think that. I mean, I do know that. I think in this case that wasn't what was going on. There's no the connection with the eye is not going to regrow back if you destroy the cortex it might, well, if you did it at birth, something that might be some recovery, but this was done in an adult animal, and we knew from post-mortem that she didn't have any visual cortex left. It hadn't regrown. No, she was using the primitive visual system, but what's so interesting is that it turned out, we later found with humans, that the vision which recovers after removing the striate cortex, the physical cortex, isn't anything like the vision which you and I experience. It's unconscious vision. It's vision which we don't understand that we're having. It's as if there's nothing like it to see with what's called blindsight, which is a word which Larry Weisskranz coined later on to explain, to give a name to what he found in human patients. Because, of course, once we'd developed this model, monkey model, of course, the question was, would humans be able to do the same? Weisskranz did a good thing. He knew that I thought that Helen could see, but didn't know that she could see. And so I said, I think her problem's been trying to persuade her she can do something which she doesn't understand, because it's not like anything to see. So he took that up, and with a human patient called DB, who was blind in one half of his field as a result of removing half the visual cortex, as a result of a stroke. This patient, for all he knew, was completely blind in that part of the visual field. Larry decided to say to him, yes, of course, I accept what you say, and you're the authority on what you can see and what you can't. But supposing I was to hold up a light in this blind part of your field, I wonder, I'm doing it right now, supposing you could guess, supposing you had to guess where the light is, if you could see it. The patient's reaction was, doctor, what are you asking me to do? You're trying to make fun of me. No, I'm not. It's a good question. I want to see just how you're going to, if you try, what will happen. And it turned out the patient could guess the position of a light which he couldn't see. He couldn't consciously see. And it went on, Weisskranz went on to show in humans that a human with blind sight after removal of the visual cortex can not only find the position of an object, you can tell the color, the shape, the position in space, basically. And recently there was a case of a patient studied by Weiskrantz who could walk through a cluttered room of obstacles without touching anything at all, and yet all the while denied that he had any vision. This was a very rare case of someone who had damage to both sides of the visual cortex. So the reason partly why this was so important to the way my own thinking went, because it happened very early on in my career as a psychologist, it made me take seriously a distinction which had been made by a philosopher called Thomas Reid between perception and sensation. Thomas Reid is not really ever taken seriously anymore. He was a Scottish philosopher of the Enlightenment. He had a lot to say about ethics and morals and so on. But he also did excellent work on the basic nature of experience. And he said all our senses have a double province. They allow us to perceive and they allow us to feel. And he said, and perception and sensation are very different things, and we mustn't confuse them. And I think that's absolutely right and should be at the center of all studies of the sensory systems. Perception on one side, sensation on the other, and they can be separated. In ordinary experience, of course, they're usually not. But in a strange case like after this kind of brain damage, you end up with a person who can perceive but has no sensation. Pure perception. It's very difficult to even imagine what it would be like to have blindsight.
Michael Graziano and I were just talking about how the woman who picks the two houses, and one house is on fire, and you can see through the windows on the one side of the house there's flames. She always picks the house that's not on fire, but she doesn't know, due to the hemispatial neglect, that why she's picking the house that's not on fire. And that's a clear example of what you're talking about.
Well, it is, and it isn't. I mean, I think it's she actually doesn't have access to her perceptual information on that side. I don't think we're talking here about what I mean, which is the experience of sensations simply at the level of what's happening at my sense organs. That doesn't involve any sophisticated analysis of it's a fire or not a fire. I think it's just like nothing. I mean, to be able to see without having experiences, like I think a bit like having telepathy. I'm saying I don't believe, of course, in telepathy, but I've sometimes taken part in experiments in which people are asked to guess what the card is, which is hidden from them, and when they get it right, you can ask, well, what's it like to know what that card is, whether it's in the wavy pattern or the triangle, whatever it may be. What's it feel like? And the answer is, it doesn't feel like anything. I just know. I just get this, I get this confidence that that's the pattern on the other side of the card. Now, I think that's not never true in the case of telepathy, but I think blindsight is very like that. They're looking at something, they know its shape, its color, whatever it is, but they've no idea how they know what it's like, and it's very disconcerting. I mean, some patients with blindsight have refused to take part in experiments because they really do feel that they're being made monkeys of. Sorry to excuse that analogy, but people are not taking them seriously when they say they're blind. So comes back to this fundamental distinction. And while all my early work was on perception, all the later work's been on sensation, which I think is what still presents us with the biggest problem philosophically, trying to understand the quality of sensation. And that's where phenomenal consciousness comes in.
I mean, so because even within the philosophy of perception, there's so much debate going on, particularly when we consider naive realism, the fact that we're perceiving this reality that is nothing like the genuine reality that's out there. So the ontology and the epistemology don't match up. What we're saying is actually there is not really what is in front of us. But
I don't know. Say what you mean by that. I mean, what is really in front of us? Now, if I look at a table, in what sense is there not a table there?
Okay, so if someone says, for example, the fact that the table is actually made up of atoms, made up of quarks, we don't get to see that level of experience of reality.
Oh, sure, okay. So, but that's all we're saying. We don't have the fine-grained resolution, which we might have if we had electron microscopes instead of eyes. But it's that what we're not designed to do that.
Mm-hmm.
We've designed to represent the world in a way which makes it suits us for the purpose of interacting with it and making sense of it. So we need to know what affordances it offers us. What are we going to be able to do with the things we see and touch and hear? And that doesn't, I mean, to have described that at the level of quarks would be no use whatever. I mean,
Sure.
Someone who had that ability would be dead a long time ago because they wouldn't show any common sense. But so I think it's a bit of a I don't think there's any deep problem there. I know people do want to say reality is an illusion, but it's not an illusion. It's what it is. At that level of description, that tables are as real as quarks are at the other level of description.
I mean, they often talk about our reality. I mean, we're right in the middle. We don't get to see what's really tiny, nor do we get to see what's really vast and cosmic. So from quantum to cosmic, we're pretty much slap bang in the middle, and we don't even know if that's true.
Well, thank goodness that's the area that we live in, the sweet zone between. I mean, I would neither want to live in the world of cosmology or in the world of quantum physics. It's humans are designed, as all our relations among the animal kingdom are, to exploit this wonderful world which is on offer to us.
Then what do you think about the limitations of our biology? Because, I mean, we know around the atmosphere around the planet, they even call it the optic window, the optical window, something like that, because it only allows infrared to ultraviolet radiation to enter the atmosphere, which is why most species can only see red, orange, yellow, green, violet. Some species can see infrared, some ultraviolet. So what are your thoughts then on the fact that we're not exposed to the vast amount of experience that is possible, both in terms of chemically, our nose, I mean, your dog can smell a lot more than us. We can't see as much that's really out there. But certain things that are out there could possibly affect us in ways that we might not know. Because we cannot perceive it. We have developed the tools.
Well, they could do, I agree. I mean, for example, there's a limited amount of evidence that humans have a magnetic sense. And we know that birds have a magnetic sense, and some insects do as well. So, yes, I agree. There probably are influences which we're not aware of. I don't think they're very strong influences. I think on the whole, the things which matter to us have by now reached consciousness. I mean, if you're designing a human brain, why would you, if information is relevant to living successfully in the world, then natural selection will almost certainly have made certain that the brains of humans or other animals which need it have access to that information. We can't perceive ultraviolet because, on the whole, it's not relevant to our own ecology. And
what I was actually trying to get with that was, do you think that these perceptual limitations, these sensory limitations in a sense, will affect our quest to understand this entire problem, or just understanding as a whole?
No, I think we accept we have limitations, and we can't live in two places at once or whatever. There's lots of things we can't do. And most of them, it wouldn't be actually much help to be able to do for the kind of lives we lead. Now, you're saying that as scientists, if only we had X-ray eyes or whatever it is, then that would make the life of the scientist easier because we wouldn't have to develop sophisticated instrumentation to gather the data which we need. But that's, I mean, I don't think it's a problem for which in a sense we have to regret. I mean, I don't feel sad that I can't see parts of the world which I can't see. That what's there is quite enough, and in fact, sometimes more than enough. Of course, look, take a case of autistic kids who are overwhelmed by sensations. They don't want more sensations. If you added magnetic sense to the world of an autistic child, it would just go and hide in a corner. They already do that because they find sensory experience overwhelming. So
that's actually why
it's interesting. Sorry.
I also feel like virtual realities. I mean, these virtual reality headsets. We're constantly trying to make these technologies that can augment and enhance our experiences, but they're so dangerous in the sense that we haven't evolved the mindset or the biological framework that can handle some of these experiences. I mean, you put
no, you're right, but it may be that in some areas, if we're introduced to these new ways of seeing early enough in our life, we will have time to actually develop and learn to incorporate them in a much more familiar way into our world. But what was I going to say? I mean, no. Come back to the question just before that.
I was just talking about the fact that we have these perceptual limitations, and it might hinder our quest to actually understand what the human mind is capable of, or what we're really experiencing.
Yeah, I don't have a lot of time for saying that the human mind will never get access to some things, either because of sensory limitations or because of conceptual ones. It's been quite fashionable for a long time now to say there are problems which are out of reach, which we will never understand. Well, it's like asking a dog to understand quantum theory, whatever it may be. It never could. And maybe there are problems which humans could never get to the bottom of. It's Goethe said that, and he reveled in it. He wanted there to be problems which were beyond human capacity to understand. Diderot, the great French philosophe, wrote the Encyclopedia. He said this nice thing that he said, philosophy for years told us there were things which we couldn't know. They said, for example, that light couldn't be decomposed. Then empirical philosophy, science, invented the prism and said, we can decompose light, and here it is, and we can do it. We need both technological and conceptual tools for decomposing the things which we thought we couldn't understand before. And I found, even good friends of mine, Martin Rees, Professor Astronomer Royal, Professor of Astronomy in Cambridge, he has said and does say in public that he thinks that the human brain has limitations on what it could ever begin really to get to grips with and find satisfactory explanations for. Supposing he'd said that to Plato or Aristotle, of course it was Plato couldn't have understood quantum theory. Plato couldn't understand how to take the cube root of something, didn't understand the number zero. The things which school children can do now, which great philosophers of the past couldn't do. And it's because our culture has scaffolded them. It's found ways of introducing these concepts, making them sense, making them common knowledge. And so intellectual culture is cumulative. And we can draw on the insights and the breakthroughs which were made in the past by people who did find them at time almost impossible to conceive of. I'll tell you a good example of it: the idea of irrational, of impossible numbers involving the square root of -1. Every not 10-year-old, but every 15-year-old at school is already working with unreal numbers and has found out how to use them in engineering and in practice and so on. But Leibniz, who was one of those who invented them, was totally spooked by them. He called them amphibious numbers, which are both real and not real at the same time. And you can see what a puzzle it was for him, just as it was a puzzle for the early mathematicians to understand how there could possibly be a number, a negative number. Negative numbers seemed a contradiction in terms. Okay, but I'm just making the example that we build and we get that.
Isaac Newton describes it well as well. When he says, if I have seen further, it is by standing upon the shoulders of giants. Basically, he's talking about this cumulative effect of knowledge.
Yes, absolutely right.
Yeah.
So I was just, do you know the riposte to that by somebody who hasn't seen as far as other people? He says, if I haven't seen further than I have done, it's because I've had giants standing on my shoulders.
That's a nice one. So when it comes to this quest, I mean, we've spoken about the sensory limitations, the perceptual limitations. You don't feel like that would be a hindrance per se. But if you had to describe consciousness in a single line, your view on consciousness now, because you've mentioned your views have changed over time. How do you think they've changed, and why do you think they've changed? What do you think has happened within your own cognitive repertoire that has led you towards this change?
Well, it was coming out as a brash young research student. I came up with a theory of consciousness, about how it was used, how introspective consciousness was what gave us the capacity to read our own minds and so to understand what it's like to be another person. I called that natural psychology. And it came out of my work with primates in the field, and then just looking at actually turning it back on myself and saying, well, how do I understand what's going on in the minds of other people? I do it by putting myself in their place. How can I put myself in their place? Because I know what it's like to be me. How do I know what it's like to be me? Because I've got this faculty of introspection, or even to put it concretely, I've got an organ, an introspective organ, which I call the inner eye. Now, I think that's a good idea, and I think that actually lots of work since then has shown that animals and humans do develop the capacity to read minds by using themselves as a model. It makes a lot of sense about how we can get along in the social world, which otherwise might be almost unreadable. Doing psychology is very difficult, as the behaviorist psychologists discovered when they tried to do it simply by scientific observation. We don't have to do it by scientific observation. We do it by inner observation. We can build up a very sophisticated model of behavior and what it's like, how humans will behave, simply by seeing what it's like for us. Okay, so that was a good idea. And I wrote several books about it. I even made a 6-part television series called The Inner Eye. But I realized, and partly because critics pointed out, Stuart Sutherland, for example, reminded me in a review. He said, well, okay, this is all very interesting and nice, and it's a good idea, and it does perhaps explain the origins of reflexive consciousness, but it doesn't explain the hard problem, the question of why it's like something to have this view of our own, what's workings of our own minds, why it has this other dimension to it. And of course, I thought, well, yeah, he's right, it doesn't. And therefore, that's the problem which I now want to work out before I'm through with this field. Now, that was back in, how old was I then? Probably 25. I'm now 78. Since then, I've been slowly pushing away at this other big problem, which is the nature of sensation. And it meant, in some sense, going back to the drawing board, going back to asking, where do we begin with? Well, we need to begin by making a principled distinction between perception and sensation, between what we are taking in, how we're representing the outside world, and how we're representing our own immediate experience of sensory stimulation. It's the second which has these qualitative characters to it. But why do we need it if it's not needed for perception? And Blindsight seemed to show it wasn't needed for perception. Then why do we need sensation as well? And why, given that we've got it, what's the point in imbuing it with these extraordinary properties? And that led me to think, well, what it's about is it's about changing our understanding of what it's like to be ourselves and why we matter, giving us a new sense of our metaphysical status, our position in nature, which then drives all our ambitions. It becomes doubly important. In fact, where it becomes most important is when we say, okay, and it's not just me, it's you and you and you. Others also have a center of self, which is equally wonderful, equally important to them. And by respecting that, we can begin to develop a world of intersubjectivity, which actually allows human culture and human society to function, or not. When it functions like that. You said, what's going on with the riots in South Africa and so on. We know how easily we can forget how human other people are, and that we forget how little we share with them, and to begin to distance us. But basically, sensory consciousness, phenomenal consciousness, lies at the bottom of our ability to get along with others and to believe in ourselves. Now, compared with my own earlier work, of course, that is, it sounds awfully wishy-washy, hand-waving stuff about the phenomenal self and so on. And so what I've been basically trying to do in all my work recently is to put flesh on those bones, to actually make a model in the brain of why we should represent our experience as having surreal properties, to come back to the idea of phenomenal surrealism. Why it would benefit us to think of ourselves as being more than we really are. And that's why when I talk to Dan and Dennis and Keith Frankish and others and say, hang on, I don't think you're doing yourselves any good, or any of us any good, by calling this an illusion, because you seem to be disparaging it. Illusions are mistakes. Nobody wants to be subject to illusions. They don't realize that actually these illusions are the very foundation of the way we rise above the material world. Now, we need another name for it, or we need to stop calling it, certainly implying that it's a mistake. Scientifically and politically, it's not a good move.
Broadly, you would say that your view still very much aligns with the illusionist view, except that the word itself is a problem. I mean, you have to do a lot of backtracking. You have to start explaining who is viewing this illusion. You have to go through debates that come with saying consciousness is an illusion, which, for the most part, when people read it, I think at the face of it, they just read the word illusion and draw false conclusions about it.
Yeah,
would you think?
I agree, and that's.
I was considering naming it Magicism. Do you think that would have been a better option?
Well, yes, I actually think it would have been.
He said that David Chalmers was actually the one who convinced him to name it Illusionism.
Was it? Okay, well, I don't know what gender David had.
That's what I said.
But I mean, yes, no, I think Keith should have stuck to his guns and called it Magicism, because that would have, magic's wonderful. We all, we don't find it magical tricks are not somewhat. We don't disparage them, but if we were to say, if you were told you were going to see an illusionist, well, actually, still you might think of that as magic, but nonetheless, you're right. I mean, the point is that we need to regard this not as a form of any kind of mistake, let alone as some kind of program to pull the wool over the eyes of skeptics or whatever it is. No, these experiences, which seem to be more than they really are the very essence of the way we move forward. And they're not false, because as I said earlier, feelings can have any properties you want. We say that the physical world is limited, it only exists in 4 dimensions, but feelings, why should feelings only exist in 4 dimensions? They can have whatever properties turn out to be useful. And if thinking of them as having as bringing us in some sense to live outside of material world, if that works for us, it works for us. Mm-hmm. And our feelings actually have those properties. And I experience pain, for example, I experience it as having my relationship to what's happening, this thorn in my flesh or whatever it is properly described by the experience I have, in which I call an experience as qualitative pain. It's not an illusion. It's what the feeling is. And the feeling then, is then the thing we go on to work with and to share and to start attributing to other people when we see them in similar circumstances and so on.
I just want to
I think illusionism is bad politics, as I said.
Yeah, no, definitely it is. There's a lot of backtracking that has to occur once you mention the word illusion. There's so much you have to say. But I just want to touch briefly back on this difference between sensations and perceptions, because ideally, when someone, let's take, for example, looks at a sunset, we don't just see a sunset. We attach memories to the sunset. We remember the first time we perhaps kissed a loved one in front of a sunset. We remember the day you broke your leg in front of a sunset. There's all these different, you remember that at that very moment you're perhaps hearing sound of traffic behind you. There's a lot of things going on. So at some point your brain has to filter all of this information and create some sort of perceptual experience. Are you saying then that there is a separation between this perceptual construction and the actual sensation?
Yeah, I still think it is. I think you could have a lot of the things which you're just talking about at the level of perception. I can imagine a robot with an artificial system of vision, for example, and a fair amount of experience of the world, making just the kind of judgments you're talking about when it looks at a sunset. But I still don't think it would be having the qualia, the experience of the redness and the brightness and so on, which is added to our own experience. So I think it's, I know, because you come from with a background of interest in hallucination and mental paradoxes of that sort, and I think that's making you continually hark back to this other sense of illusionism, of getting things wrong, and why do we sometimes exaggerate or misread what's out there in nature. And I want to say that while in seeing a sunset, there's another side to it in which we're not misreading it. We are having an experience which is true and is true to us, and which we should, and be in no sense ashamed to sing about.
No, I actually agree. I mean, although I'm asking the question in that manner, I firmly believe that these heuristics, these shortcuts, these perceptual limitations are all adaptive advantages for our environment. And this is the way we are meant to perceive the world and reality. This is how it should be. In fact, even if you do take the illusionist view, I still consider these tricks of the mind to be awe-inspiring tricks of the mind. We should actually sit in awe of the fact that our brains are capable of doing this in the first place.
Right. Yes, right.
I mentioned the fact that, but for me, I also don't believe in qualia as a phenomenal property that has a substantive essence, like substance. I talk about what I say. I mentioned this to Keith, was I don't see us as human beings experiencing what it is like to be in the universe. I see the universe experiencing what it is like to be humans.
That's very Zen.
It's spiritual almost.
I know. Yeah, okay. I know what you mean, but I'm not sure how helpful it is to put it that way around.
Yeah, what's the practical significance? Well, I mean,
so what? Okay, the universe isn't experiencing anything. You're going the way of Rupert Sheldrake.
No, I definitely don't mean it that way. That's not, and I don't want it to be misread as that way. I'm actually my chat.
But it will be.
That's the thing. I mean, but that's the problem. What do you think about this then? If anyone talks about something, I would consider myself someone very scientific. I look at the evidence. I try and make sure I'm drawing verifiable conclusions about what I'm experiencing. But now, when I mention something like that, it's automatically put into the spiritual, supernatural realm. And I don't mean it in that way at all, just so we're clear, so everyone knows. But But I do think that there's no substantive property. I don't think that evolution works in a way that it would create this essence like phenomenal experience.
Well, what I don't know, I use the word substantive as well, and so but I know how slippery it is. When I say that the mathematical objects we create in our brain through these attractor states created by reverberating loops, I say that gives us something substantive at the center of our minds to hold on to. It's substantive and it's not substantive.
I mean, there is no locus in a sense. There's no locus in the brain.
No, right.
And you find that's where consciousness is. I mean, we know that that's definitely not the case. The search for new correlates is almost like
of course.
an impossible search. But
what
are your thoughts on the fact that panpsychism is growing as much as it is in this current landscape?
I think it's real cause for sadness. Philosophy hasn't been very successful over the last 50 years or so, but it's done something, and it's gone some. If it's had any achievement, it's been in cleaning up the language we use about talking about the mind, saying that there's some things which really don't even count as proper sentences because they don't make sense. And a lot of work was done by Gilbert Ryle onwards, and Dennett in particular, a student of Ryle, to try and get us to talk straight about the mind and experience and consciousness and so on. And it's as if this new generation, Philip Goff and others, decided, okay, that's the old fogies. Forget about that. Let's go back to the romantic idea of the universe being just internally conscious. It is a very old idea. They may think they've invented it, but it's been said again and again over the last few hundred years. Look at the Encyclopedia Britannica of 1920, a big article on panpsychism and psychonic theory of the universe. How every little bit of it is a little bit conscious, and they then built up to larger structures of consciousness. I remember in that 1920 edition, it ends up by saying the psychonic theory is currently under experimental investigation. Well, nobody ever told us what became of the experimental investigation. But the fact is that panpsychism can't really be tied down by experiment. It doesn't make any real predictions. Integrated information theory makes some predictions, but I don't think they're predictions about phenomenal consciousness, which is what they claim to be.
I'm actually going to chat to Philip in I think 2 weeks. I'm chatting to Philip. I remember listening actually to one of your discussions.
We had one at Hay, didn't we? Yes. Yes, probably the one what was with Philip, was it? Sue Blackmore and me and Philip had it.
Yeah, I think I'm thinking about the one with you, Sue, and Philip. Yes, it was the three of you guys discussing consciousness together, and both you and Sue Blackmore were sitting on the one side, Philip on the other, and you just cannot wrap your head around panpsychism. I know you just say this is completely something you cannot wrap your head around.
Well, I agree. I would find it very hard to think like a panpsychist, but I'm also well aware that I ought to. Poet Coleridge had a very good principle. He said, "You don't ever think you accuse somebody of thinking." You don't tell people they're ignorant or stupid or that they've got the wrong idea until you understand their misunderstanding.
Yes.
And he said that what you first need to do is think, how could they have got to that position?
Yes.
And identify with that, and then see how to pull back from it. I perhaps fail in that direction. I find it quite hard to get inside Philip's head. Philip and I shared a cabin in a sailboat on a famous consciousness cruise. Dan Dennett and a rich Russian organized a wonderful trip for philosophers of consciousness.
Yes, I saw that online. I think this was a few years ago.
Yeah, well, Philip turned out Philip and I ended up in the same, with one bunk, another above the other, so we got to know each other quite well. But
So I was telling Keith that, because Keith and Philip also they've debated about this quite a lot. But I said I still think it's important, although I have a certain fixed view on consciousness and what I believe. This podcast is to explore all these ideas and try and figure out why we have all these biases towards certain directions. And I mentioned to Keith that there's this book. It's called Mind Body Problems. I think it's by John Hagen. I'm not sure if I'm getting his name correct, but he takes an in-depth probe into the nature of each person studying consciousness. For example, he looks at
John Hagen. Yeah, it's John Hagen. He's a scientific American writer, isn't he?
Yes.
And I know, and he's published it online, because I think the book wasn't actually brought out as a print book. Good. Well, I haven't read it,
and so he basically
but I know about the book.
In depth about each person. The actual. So, for example, let's take Nicholas Humphrey, and let's look at Nicholas Humphrey's life. What would lead him to this conclusion that consciousness might be an illusion? Or let's take Christoph Koch. What may have happened in his search for romance that led to this romantic search for consciousness? And it's intriguing for someone to do something like that for many reasons.
Absolutely agree. Yeah, I don't know. This book I've just written about sentience, I say explicitly, I'm going to do something unusual here to explain where I've come from and why my views are really not popular at the moment, but I hold strongly to them. And so then I go back over the things which happened to me between the ages of 20 and 30, which basically set the sails for where I ended up now. And I'm sure you're right, we'd all find reasons within ourselves. Christoph Koch's a strong Christian, for example, which is a position which, basically I cannot even begin to understand. But it clearly colors his views about consciousness.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, on that note, what are your views in terms of this interlinking of searching for the soul, searching for consciousness, and religion? What are your thoughts on that, religion in itself?
Well, I think religion, I shouldn't generalize. I think religion has been a great asset for human beings. I think we needed something like that as a way of trying to come to terms with the world we live in and what our place is in it. I think we particularly needed it at the point when we became sufficiently intelligent to begin to see the problem, which is we're going to die. Now, everything for the last so many million years about the developing psychology of animals and human beings has been premised on the idea that the most important thing in the world is you and your life and continuing that life. Everything's invested in that. And then we get betrayed. Our bodies grow old and fade, and we suddenly find that our usefulness to nature is no longer there anymore. And I think that's an extraordinary difficult thing to come to terms with. It can lead to existential despair. I mean, I've written recently about suicide and about the problems which must have arisen once people began to understand death.
Yes, I was actually going to touch on that at some point later on in the talk. But on that note, growing up, were you very religious? What was your religious?
No, I wasn't religious at all. I don't think I was ever tempted by a belief in supernatural deities. Were you?
I grew up in a mixture. So my mom's side of the family is Muslim. My dad's side of the family is Hindu. But I was probably atheist from the time I was, for as long as I can remember. I mean, I've never been very religious at all. When people ask me about my religious views, I often say, I'm agnostic about the origins of the universe, but I'm 99.9 recurring % atheist. So that's pretty much how I would sum up my views around theism.
Well, I'm sure we're kin in that respect.
Yeah.
But I was saying that I think religion has been valuable.
No, certainly. I also believe so. I think especially in trying to answer those questions in a time where we had so little information to use, it was very helpful for many reasons. And still, even with regards to what you were just discussing, suicide, if you look at some of the relationships between those people who commit suicide and those who don't, certain religions certain spiritual beliefs do help reduce
suicide amongst Muslims is very, very much lower than in other religions, for example.
Yeah, exactly. So
No, I agree.
have these protective elements.
Religions can be protective.
From a health perspective,
I think
about some of the ritualistic behavior that comes with certain religions. If you think about the fact that you're having this morning prayer, giving thanks, saying thanks, having these gatherings every Sunday, all these things that we stop doing once you take this reductive approach to the universe. I often wish that, because growing up, I felt like the outsider for not being religious, and everyone around me is going to the everyone around me is going to the temple, everyone around me is going to the mosque, and then on that day when everyone's around, I'm basically sitting at home doing nothing. So there is this element where you think like these practices have so much value culturally, and we should somehow utilize this even in this wave of new atheism that's coming around.
Yes, I agree with you, and haven't yet found good substitutes.
Exactly, yeah. And it's very difficult.
Euro 2020 is not a good substitute for religion, although it's a way of bonding with people.
I mean, but the conclusion of the Euros was like the beginning of the war that started happening here. It was like, for South Africans, it was just all too much. Everything's just going crazy at this point.
So anyway, but to come back to your point, I think religions have certainly in the past been crucial to providing the kind of confidence in that the world has meaning, which humans needed before they had scientific explanations and the other sorts of excuses we can still find for saying the world is a good place, even if we're going to die. But nonetheless, I think religions have gone on, firstly by monopolizing the truth and arguing for a very particular interpretation of meaning, and a particular interpretation of the afterlife and the possibility of immortality and so on. I think they've been entirely negative. I think, basically, it's not a good thing to live off lies, and religions feed people with lies. So I've said I thought that religions, they've hijacked the soul. I mean, I think humans have hijacked spirituality. Spirituality has been present in humans for a very, very long time, and for as long as we've really begun to think about consciousness and what it must mean about the nature of, about our status here on Earth, the possibility that our minds are independent of our bodies and so on, which we're encouraged to think by the structure of our experience. Those give us spiritual ambitions and spiritual comforts, which I think are almost entirely good. That was nature, natural selection was doing its job in providing us with adaptive ways of thinking. But the risk has been, and it's been proved again and again, that those very same ideas can be taken over and misused.
But that's why I appreciate the fact that a lot of your writing, scientific writing, takes on a very poetic, artistic essence with it. I mean, you don't just write in a very reductive manner. You obviously do reduce certain things that some people will claim as a reductive approach, but you often add this layer of entertainment / poetry, art.
It's not entirely entertainment. I think use poets as evidence.
Yes.
I think the fact is that they are, the writings of the poets and the monks and the spiritualists and the mystics and so on are some of the best evidence we've got of the kind of ambitions which humans naturally have. Some of them are much more talented at expressing it than others, but they're the glory of human culture, and they're only made possible because of the nature of conscious experience. Nobody would have begun to think like that unless they had this yearning to explain a mystery. they're not kind of just confetti on the surface of the world. They are the very center of it. They're what make humans who they are, and have provided the reasons why human genes have flourished. It's really not an accident that humans are biologically the most successful species on Earth, because we've got spirituality. I'm sure it's been absolutely essential to it.
I mean, that's exactly why when I said we are, the universe experiencing what it is like to be humans. I mean, there's almost no metaphysical meaning to what I just said, but how I find this almost spirituality within the universe and my lack of religion is when you take into account the genuine story of the cosmos. I mean, looking at the Big Bang, looking at what happens, looking at how stars form our atoms, forge all these elements just before they explode and go supernova, how these clouds of dust come together, eventually form planets, our species start to evolve over time. It takes billions of years. I mean, that's a genuinely amazing story. That is a story that should be told as a story and not just as a science lecture. I mean, this is something that should be written in almost like a Bible / Quran /
Yeah, and luckily we've actually got people who can seem to do it. Brian Cox isn't a bad example. I don't know if you've seen his programs and his enthusiasm for explaining.
Brian Green also does the same thing. Brian Cox and Brian Green.
Sorry?
I said Brian Cox and Brian Green does a similar thing. I mean,
yes, of course, absolutely. Yeah.
So I think that's exactly what we need, is more writers to do that, because that lack of spiritual, just merely reducing us, saying we're in the middle of this cosmos, in the middle of nowhere. We're on a tiny rock in a solar system, in a galaxy, in a supercluster, in a 14.8 billion light years across. I mean, it tends to have this almost existential dread with it.
Yes, I agree. And what you're saying, and I'm absolutely with you, is that you say, yeah, this is where we are, and isn't it wonderful?
Yeah,
how can it be? We're privileged to hold this relationship to the rest of the universe, and to not increasingly have an understanding of it.
Being alive, I mean, the trillions of sperm cells that have to make us at some point, the thousands of eggs, the odds of being here. I mean, it can be read very spiritual when you take it all together.
Yeah, right. But those are things we discover as we grow up. No child of 4 has that sense of the wonders of nature, but it can have a sense of the wonders of itself. So that's, I think, we're given this platform to take off from. We're magic. Then we discover that everyone else is magic, and the universe is magic too. But it's very difficult not, of course, to start being to want to show off about that and say, look, humans can do it and no one else can. And doesn't that show that we're really the most important creatures on Earth? In some sense, it does. I mean, if humans were, I just was quoting something from Thomas Mann, who said, in my deepest soul, I hug the idea that with God's let it be and the creation of the universe, it was man who was ultimately intended. And of course, that's not allowed for an evolutionist. We weren't intended. But nonetheless,
you think then that it's artificial intelligence will become the new man that he's actually referring to?
Well, it's a very interesting question there, and I go on my riff on what Thomas Mann said is that it wasn't man that was ultimately intended, but I think, and he said, and if through our folly we destroy human life, well, that would be amount to the rejection of creation itself. I say, well, I wonder how Darwin would have taken that argument. And I think that even Darwin would have said, okay, there's something at the end of the process of evolution, which does seem to have absolute value. And it isn't human life or poetry or whatever it is, but it is phenomenal consciousness. I think phenomenal consciousness is so extraordinary. And so, in a sense, it's a singularity. It's outside of of the rest of the universe. And if phenomenal consciousness became extinct, I think creation would have lost something which it could possibly never create again. I also say, and I don't know what you think about this, I think it's extremely likely that we are the only phenomenal creatures in the universe, the phenomenally conscious creatures in the universe. I think life will have evolved many times over, but it took a series of very extraordinary accidents for consciousness to evolve on Earth, consciousness, the kind we've been talking about. It took a lot of lucky breaks. Just so happened the next step was there for the taking. And so humans and our ancestors took advantage, leapfrogged up to the next level, which ends up with us discussing the nature of seeing red. I don't think any other creature in the universe is probably going that way. I mean, of course.
So would you then take everything? Would you then take a completely biological naturalism view, like John Saul? Do you think then an artificial intelligence will not be able to experience this?
Oh no, not at all. I think it could. I mean, because I think it lies in the functional properties of the brain, and the brain can be made of lots of other things and still have the same functional properties as input-out relationships and so on. I absolutely believe we could. Well, not yet, but we will in the future be able to produce machines which are phenomenally conscious once we understand what the circuits are which generate it in our own brain. The question is, why would we want to? I don't think for a moment that any machine that exists is even taking the first step towards it. People like Danny Hillis says, the internet, the World Wide Web is probably phenomenally conscious, and it hasn't bothered to tell us yet. But I don't think for a moment it is going to be. Phenomenal consciousness is an evolutionary addition in the evolutionary line which led to us and to dogs and chimps and others. It's been put there with specially dedicated circuits designed because natural selection found that they brought advantages to creatures who thought about themselves like that. Now,
what do you think about other species like Homo Neanderthal, for example? Do you think they possessed similar types of phenomena?
Yes,
they had very, very similar.
Surely Neanderthals did, because I think the bonobos do. So, though whether we don't know whether Neanderthals could have discussed consciousness. But once language took off, the very first topic of conversation would be I, me, you, who are we? What are we doing here? Children in the playground start asking deep philosophical questions, like, how do I know that what you see as red couldn't be what I see as green, and so on. I mean, we're born philosophers, and as soon as we became linguistic beings, we were doing philosophy. I'm sure of that. One day machines may be doing philosophy, but they won't be asking questions about consciousness unless, to begin with, somebody has decided, or maybe they've decided to evolve themselves in this direction, to put consciousness in place. It could be the two reasons why I think engineers might want to do it. First is that increasingly we're going to be relying on surrogate humans, surrogate human robots, to do the jobs of exploring space for us. Humans are too frail. We can't go out and explore deep into extras outside the solar system. And yet, it probably will take not manned flights, but flights with intelligences on board who are to explore it, to ask the right questions, to be interested to notice the most, the surprises which emerge and so on, and think about them and begin to act as natural scientists of the new worlds they're exploring. We will need to make robots with that kind of intelligence and that kind of creativity to do it. They're going to have to live in a community of robots. Robotic communities are going to have to understand each other. That's the point at which we might suddenly want to think, well, okay, maybe it will be worth putting phenomenal consciousness in order that they will start thinking of others as being special in this respect and as having a shared nature with them. It might also be that these robots exploring light years away from us will begin to cross their mind on, why are we here? What are we doing? What's the point of it all? Okay, we're sending these messages back to Houston, but what's it got to do with us? What is the point of all this work we're putting in and our own existence? Then again, it might be worth helping them solve that problem by giving them phenomenal consciousness. There may be other ways of doing it, but we're certainly going to have to think about robots from the psychiatric point of view as well as the intellectual point of view. Why should they do the jobs we want them to do? Once they get clever enough, they're going to start asking deep and rather worrying questions about what it's all about. So that's one reason.
Ethical questions that then and there's so many ethical questions that will arise immediately. I mean, and should you switch this computer off? Should you switch the robot off? I mean, that's not killing someone.
Yeah, well, the questions which they're going to have to answer for themselves because they're going to have to be autonomous. I mean, once we can't continually be directing things from a space center on Earth. These are going to have to evolve in their own way, and to succeed, they're going to need psychological traits, which at the moment nobody's thinking about. Mm-hmm. So that's one reason why I think we might want to design robots to have phenomenal consciousness once we really have worked out how to do it. But I also think it's a kind of Thomas Mann point. I think it would be a failure of creation if we don't.
Mm. So do you
Humans and animals on Earth are probably the only creatures which have phenomenal consciousness. We're vulnerable.
Mm.
Supposing something
other
happened.
Species, for example, dolphins. Do you think dolphins have just intelligence rather than?
No. I think dolphins. I actually think that mammals and birds, almost all of them, have phenomenal consciousness.
Okay.
For particular reasons I could explain. I think it's only warm-blooded animals which have it. I think it was a particular turning point in the evolution of the brain when brains warmed up or bodies warmed up in order to enable us to lead lives independent of the vagaries of the local environment. But warming up didn't just enable us to live in cold places and so on. By doubling or tripling the temperature of the brain, we hugely increased the speed of conductivity. It's something nobody ever talks about. Warm brains are much, much faster than cold brains, by orders of magnitude. And for the kind of circuits which I think were crucial to getting phenomenal consciousness off the ground, these reverberating loops, I think that increase in temperature might suddenly have created a phase shift in which brains began to have new kinds of internal activity, and that was the crucial development. It happened to go hand in hand with psychological changes which were brought about by independent living, which is possible for warm-blooded animals. So there was a kind of perfect storm. We got a new kind of, we began to occupy, our ancestors to occupy a different kind of ecological niche, but also to have brains which were capable possibly of generating the kind of myths about themselves which would go with that. So come back to your question. Yes, I think dolphins absolutely are phenomenally conscious.
I mean, something common about them, dolphins, birds, and humans, is there's clear communication going on between those species. Do you think linguistics, and I'm going to chat to Noam Chomsky on the 30th of September, I think, and I mean, he talks about linguistics like this, our spoken language being the most fundamental element here. Do you have similar views on that, or do you think it's purely the perception and sensory inputs that play the big?
No, I think human language is in a league of its own. I mean, it's the only. We shouldn't really talk about other languages as being language if our model is human language. I don't think that Chomsky is right that it suddenly arose as a kind of sudden phase shift in the brain once it became complex enough. I think it had an evolutionary history of much more slow accretion to reach levels of linguistic understanding and generation we have today. But no, language is crucial, and I mean, I even understand Dan Dennett when he thinks that it's so crucial that it even has made all the difference to our qualitative experience of sensations. He thinks that that dogs can't experience the phenomenal qualities of sensation in the way we do because they can't talk about them. So good. I'm glad you're talking to Chomsky. That'll be exciting. But in terms of robots, and I mean, they will need something very like human language along with these other qualities if they're going to do the job which we want them to. And I was going to say that what sometimes worries me, and it doesn't sometimes worry, it worries everybody. We all know that life on Earth is quite fragile. It could come to an end accidentally, or something as a result of human mismanagement, and it's bound to come to a life and it's going to come to an end when the sun begins to cool down. So at some point, life on Earth is going to go extinct. Now, life is going to continue on other parts, other planets and other parts of the solar system, but phenomenally conscious life may not. That may be a one-off. This may be the only place it's evolved. Now, imagine then, I think we've got a duty to replicate it and to seed the rest of the universe with conscious life, just because it won't have, the events won't have conspired for it to evolve anywhere else. Now, some people have the view of the universe, of the many universes, which says that there are so many of them, there's an infinite number of other possible universes already out there. And if you have an infinity, something is bound to repeat itself. Well, that may be so, but I wouldn't bet on it, and I would bet on the possibility that we may be the only creatures, or the animals like us on Earth may be the only creatures which enjoy these extraordinary, I mean, I'll use the word again, miraculous experiences. So I think we will. I think one project we should take very, very seriously, we don't know how to do it yet, but when we do, will be how to make sure that phenomenal consciousness actually escapes the destruction of life on Earth.
I think like one of the approaches would be considering what, let's say, Elon Musk is doing with Neuralink, trying to create these brain machinery interfaces. I mean, do you think that would be the next step, or to? So what I'm basically trying to ask is, do you think augmenting us with technology is the better option, or should we just try and create something else that has the similar type of experience to us and let that flourish and take its own course without us once we're gone?
Well, I'm not. Yeah, I mean, taking its own course is something we need to be extremely careful about, because I'm sure you're familiar with all these questions about when the robots will turn against us and so on. You make a robot, you give it a program which makes it maximizing safety clips, and it takes it so seriously that it destroys the whole of the world in order to turn it into paper clips. We be careful what we wish for. But so I think we do need to, at the moment, keep a very tight rein on technology. Dan Dennett says, and I think he's quite right, that machines must be like slaves. I mean, that's what their status should be. We don't want them to be autonomous in the sense of ethically and morally autonomous, at least not now. But when it comes to this particular project of making them have something like phenomenal consciousness and to use it for giving themselves a sense of their own importance and the point of their existence, that's the point which it may be we should say, yeah, but go and do it somewhere else.
You see, for many people, that seems to, not to say teleology as if there is some sort of goal or purpose, but for many people, they believe that is genuinely the next step. We're just building blocks that are headed towards some sort of an AI.
Martin Rees thinks that. Yes, Martin Rees thinks we're just temporary on the way to totally artificial intelligence. Yeah. Yeah.
And if you want, and if what you said you want, if we have this responsibility to almost propagate this phenomenal experience, don't you think it would be more likely to happen if a better version of us? I mean, we're so limited by our biology, as you said. If we create,
yes, no,
sorry,
no, I agree, Tevin. I think we need to explore it. At the moment, we're so far away from being able to produce AI, which is actually in any way comparable to human intelligence. We're not at that singularity which David Chalmers talks about, and we're not going to be there for a very long time. So for the time being, all we could do would be to use machinery to augment human consciousness in the kind of ways you discussed earlier, which is giving us better senses or better memory or whatever it is. But for the moment, I think biology has to stay at the center of it and to stay in control. But we'd also need to learn some lessons about augmentation isn't always the best thing. I mean, would it really be better to have better memories than we have at the moment? I mean, it may well be that we find ways of doing it.
It's traumatic.
If natural selection had wanted to produce creatures, humans or chimps for that matter, which had perfect memory, it could have gone very much further towards it than it has done. And I've actually argued that we, in several ways, have made a leap, have taken leaps forward because we had taken a leap backwards before that. That basically humans may have had to lose their memory in order to develop language, for example. There's some evidence, you probably know it, that chimpanzees have much better memory than humans, pictorial memory. The work of Matsuzawa in Kyoto, for example, he's got his chimp Ai and her daughter Aiwa can far outperform humans on simple memory tasks. Now, and we also know that humans pathologically can develop much better memory. It can happen. It can happen as a result of brain damage or autism or whatever it may be.
And we also know that
neurologists
as well. I mean, humans in general have very poor memory.
Yeah, but I'm saying that if we could have had much better memory, I think we would have done. So we need to ask why we haven't. And I think the answer is that by making certain tasks too easy, it would have stopped us from solving them in other ways, which turn out to be much more productive. Thinking in terms of concepts, because we can't have a complete memory for particulars, for example, could have been a precondition for language. I'll give you a kind of model example of this, which I've thought about. I don't entirely take it seriously, but it's an interesting question for anthropologists, why humans lost their hair. They lost it a long time ago in Africa, in environments where it brought quite a considerable disadvantage. I mean, there's nowhere on Earth which people can actually live without fire today. They can get by for a bit, but humans put themselves at a disadvantage. And it's possible, I think, that because they had to do something about being cold, they had to develop fire, they had to develop clothes, they had to develop human comforting of huddling together and so on. And those made life take off in ways which brought them to a far better state than they were before they lost their fire. I mean, making fire, for example, to keep yourself warm. Well, it doesn't just keep you warm. It allows you to cook. It keeps predators at bay. It provides a focus for sitting around and talking. So fire has a whole lot of major benefits and transforms our lives, but we probably wouldn't have done it if we hadn't been cold. So losing our hair may have provided us with just that one step backward, which made us make a cultural leap to another step forward. So it just comes back to the point you're talking about augmented brains and so on. Our brains.
I think it's very dangerous. I think our biology is we're so ingrained in our biology that a certain augmentations are going to be detrimental to human experiences. I mean, psychosis.
And you're absolutely right. I think they could produce a whole lot of distortions in reality, which we simply are not prepared for. And maybe, so I think some of your ideas about psychiatry are going in that direction, that we get into trouble not because we lose faculties, but because we gain them. And if you think about schizophrenics, for example.
Yes, exactly. Carl Friston talks about inference when he, I'm not sure if you're familiar with the work by Carl Friston.
I don't know in detail, but yes, of course I know. Yeah.
Yeah. So he also sees how if you take, so they look at the brain with the Bayesian-like principles, taking in prior information and making posterior conclusions. So if some prior information says something, you will then conclude something else. So in a sense, perceptions lead to beliefs, but it also works in a reverse way. Beliefs also lead to perceptions, which is the same reason why if you and I walk into a room, and if I'm an artist and you're a musician, the first thing you'll notice in the room is the guitar. The first thing I might notice is the painting. I mean, our perceptions and beliefs are so fundamentally intertwined and linked, and they form the basis of our reality. But the moment your perceptions or your inferences start to change, even the slightest, it can immediately lead to delusions and hallucinations. It's a very fine line.
I know it. I agree. And so you have talked to Neil Seth, or you're going to?
No, I haven't yet. But
well, Seth's got some very interesting ideas about the effects of hallucinogenic drugs in that respect, and how they might be a road to greater creativity, precisely because they interfere with our priors, and either abolish them or muddle them up, or whatever it may be. So he and of course a lot of other people see considerable promise in psychedelic drugs, which actually could have just that liberating effect on.
There's a lot of research lately on psychedelic drugs being done, and some of the results are quite outstanding. If you look at some of the treatments they're doing with depression, and you look at these patients, you have one psychedelic treatment, you get two psychotherapists together, you sit the person down, you prime them for weeks before that, you do a very high dose psilocybin or whatever psychedelic they use, give them the psychotherapy, and up to 6 months later and beyond, the person's depression is basically gone. And our current treatment of depression is poor. I mean, a lot of the drugs don't work for the majority of people. So it's quite interesting to see how these psychedelics are effective.
Absolutely. And it may have the same effect, but it's actually much less dangerous than ECT. I mean, that also basically resets all the priors, I imagine.
Exactly.
But it's interesting, isn't it? I mean, it's a question which always puzzled Darwin, is why sometimes natural selection hasn't maximized our brains or bodies, for that matter, in ways which would have been useful, and it's not clear why not. I mean, if taking psilocybin can help us, why don't we create our own psilocybin? You know, we already create endogenous opiates and so on to deal with pain. You know, when we need a bit of lifting from depression, why can't we manufacture our own magic mushrooms inside our heads? It could be because, on balance, and maybe it was tried, but on balance, it didn't prove to be such a good idea. At least for that having.
You know, my view on that is that the psilocybin plant itself, or let's take cannabis for example. I mean, it's huge all over the world right now. Everybody smokes weed. It's becoming legalized in more and more countries. In South Africa, it recently became legalized. If you think about it, that plant species evolved the traits that were needed for it to survive, because we're the ones keeping it alive. If you look around right now, we've
Do you think that?
this species.
I mean, it's growing on my lawn out here. I can tell you, there's a lot of magic mushrooms. So you mean by gardening? I mean, I'm actually giving a space for psilocybin. Yeah. Well, yes. But yes, that's an interesting idea. So in other words, we have a symbiotic relationship with psilocybin, so we don't need to. Our brains don't need to grow it for themselves. All right.
There's a mutually beneficial relationship there. Now that species continues to evolve, and in fact is doing a lot better than it was, let's say 20 years ago.
Yes, well, certainly cannabis is, isn't it? Yeah, and opium poppies, of course, did do well. Not to mention grapes.
I mean, I can guarantee you, by the time all trees are destroyed by humans, because humans are just on this destructive path, I can guarantee you that the marijuana trees will be everywhere. They'll be the ones that we'll protect for as long as possible. I mean, that's the way sort of living at this point. But on that note, what are your thoughts on psilocybin and all these psychedelic drugs and their impact on people gaining more spirituality from these experiences?
Well, because I have this rather simple model of what generates the phenomenal experience and gives us the impression of what I've called living in thick time, because these reverberating loops have a finite, the physical time lasts for an instant, it's over, as soon as it's over. The life of these loops manages to stretch it in a way so that we actually are living in the present, but in a kind of thick present, which not, I don't mean by that it has bits of the past and bits of the future. And I mean, it's got more of the present in it. I've often thought that the characteristics of these loops in our brain, I've already mentioned that warming up the brain may have made it much easier to generate them. But drugs could be having effects, again, on tweaking the parameters of the circuits in ways which make it more likely that reverberatory activity will take off and continue. And I'm interested, I won't say I know quite what it means, but by the way in which in some cases of depression, people describe visual sensory experience as being washed out, as being not having the richness, the depth which it had in their earlier lives, which of course is what is not only perhaps a consequence of depression, but a source of it as well. I mean, the world stops being magic. And so I think that depression could both be reducing the activity in these reverberating circuits, but equally other forms of drugs or even schizophrenia, changes in the brain could be increasing them, but to some extent in ways which get out of control.
When you spoke about depressive patients having this lack of experience, losing the magic, what do you think the evolutionary basis then? Because coming back to your recent work on suicide, what do you think are these evolutionary mechanisms in play that are leading us towards this path? I mean, rates are increasing, depression rates are increasing. Is it all in the brain or is it all social? Because there's a lot of debate within this.
It's not, well, it is social, and it's one of the biggest drivers of suicide is imitation, of course. I think people wouldn't kill themselves if they hadn't got a model for it and had seen someone else who has found a way out. And the scary thing for humans is that they have got a way out. I mean, all animals are programmed to try and put a stop to pain, for example. But it doesn't occur to them that they could do it by killing themselves. Humans must have got that idea 200,000-300,000 years ago. And that's a very dangerous insight, that if I can't bear life as it is at the moment, even if it's temporary pain, I can stop it by hanging myself or jumping off a cliff or whatever it may be. And in some sense, it's an absolute correct judgment. You can put a stop to pain by killing yourself, but it's a wrong judgment to make in most cases, because the pain would have been temporary. The lesson from life generally is things are not as bad as they seem to be, and if you get through this, you'll be happy again. The rates of recidivism among suicide are very small, interestingly enough. People don't do it again. So, in other words, they don't wish they got away with it before and try again. But it's I've even argued that it could have been a serious issue for human evolution. We know there are various bottlenecks in the history of human beings detected by genes and distribution of genes today, which suggest that there were serious population collapses in the history of our own species. People have said, well, it must have been disease or ice ages or war, even, or external circumstances. But I've suggested that it could have been that humans lost heart. Life was difficult. They alone amongst animals, and more than ever their ancestors had done, had seen, okay, we don't have to keep this going. Shivering in our caves with short of food, everyone quarreling, whatever it is. There's a better way, and that's not to be here at all. And that insight, as I said, is a potentially very dangerous one. And particularly once the word starts spreading, it starts getting actually taken up as an idea. I mean, we know how mad people can be. Look at Jamestown and the massacre in South America. It only took a few words from a crazed leader of some fanatical followers, and 1,000 people drank suicide. They drank cyanide. Now, whether that's ever happened naturally in the course of our history, I don't know. But there's some intriguing suggestions. There's a archaeologists have discovered so-called pit of bones. They're Neanderthals. Great pits in northern Spain, full of skeleton upon skeleton. Now, no one has any idea were they thrown there, why they're there, or maybe they jumped.
What about certain species, well, human species in ancient times, when you look at certain cultures and the way they would sacrifice for the gods? I mean, someone would do something for the greater good of others. If you look at, David Attenborough often talks about certain species and how there's always a plateau. And humans have somehow surpassed this plateau that we were meant to reach at some point in terms of population overgrowth. Do you think that there's possibly an evolutionary basis behind this? Perhaps once a species reaches a certain level, there is this driving force for some species to look around themselves. Perhaps they're a burden to their family. Perhaps they're a burden to their society as a whole, to then think that maybe them not being here is better for the rest of the population.
No, I mean, it's a very interesting thought, and that's what's called altruistic suicide. And there's certainly examples of it, of people who've killed themselves in order to relieve their family or their community of the burden. But I mean, take one dramatic example. Captain Oates, Scott's companion on his trip to the South Pole, who famously in the last days walked out into the snow to commit suicide because he thought he was not going to survive and he was a burden on the rest of the group who was dragging him along with them. So that's a clear example of altruistic suicide, and I'm sure it happens. And it's said that it's not terribly well documented that there are people who have been peoples where it's been common practice for old people to ritually commit suicide in order to relieve the burden on their descendants. It's certainly not the reason for most contemporary suicides. The last thing they have in mind is helping their families and friends. In fact, they bring devastation to them. It's often one of the cruelest things they could have done. And in the past, it's also been made legally a penalty for survivors. I mean, in Europe, right across Europe, suicides, the families of suicides would have their goods confiscated, be punished for it. So certainly the suicide was in no way helping their friends and relations. But to come back to your point, I think there could have been examples amongst humans. Whether there's any evidence in animals of anything like that. I mean, there have been cases which have been debunked, like lemmings running over cliffs when their population grows too high. Well, they certainly move on when their population becomes too high, and that may lead to some of them trying to swim to another island and they drown. So, but that wasn't a deliberate act in order to relieve the pressure.
What about a bee sting? What about a bee sting?
A bee sting? Oh, yes. Now that is a case where it clearly is in the form, an example of altruistic suicide, particularly in bees more than in wasps. Wasps have this thing which they can pull out.
Yeah.
So it doesn't hurt them. They lose the venom, but they can carry on. Bees have a hook, as some of us know, to our cost, and it tears their nose out. So they get killed. There's worker bees. So yeah, that's genetically. People understand now the genetics of that, and it's partly because these social insects have rather peculiar a system of inheritance, which means that they're much more closely related to each other. So that sisters in a bee colony are more closely related to each other than they would be to their own offspring. So the only way they can invest in the future is by investing in their sisters rather than offspring. And if protecting them against from danger is going to do it, that will have evolved. Yeah. So I think it's that level we're talking about a kind of mechanisms which run their course without any intuitions or ethical thoughts coming into it. Of course.
When you come as you get older and you think about life, looking back, and you look at euthanasia, for example, as people get older, what are your views on that? What are your thoughts? Because we were never living this long in the first place. This is the first time humans get to live to about 100.
Yeah, sure.
You get osteoarthritis.
I hope, no question, I would want to have the opportunity to bring my life to an end in lots of circumstances, and I think it's an absolute disgrace that we make it criminally prohibited for people to end their lives when they're obviously in pain and suffering and so on. I think, again, we don't want to make it too easy for everybody to end their lives for just the reason we were talking about suicide. People get it wrong. They don't realize that they would have recovered.
Around 90% of suicides are caused with mental illness involved.
No, they're not. There's been a big revision of that.
Is it?
In the West, it's true, but you look across the world, it's not true at all.
Okay.
For instance, in China and India and so on, it's shown the very small proportion of any sort of psychiatric diagnosis. They're terribly ordinary. These.
Any ideas? What do you think is predisposing it? The non-psychiatric ones.
I think it's a mistake. I think they're doing just what we were talking about. They think they can escape. Well, they know they can escape. They do escape, but nonetheless, people should help them not to do it because it isn't actually the really optimal solution for whatever problems they have.
But let's say, like for example, in a country like South Africa, we have a really huge discrepancy with regards to the wealthy and the poor. And majority of suicides in South Africa come from the more under-resourced, poorer regions. Do you think then,
like they do in India, for example? It's terribly high prevalent rates amongst the slums in Mumbai and so on, and people kill themselves.
Then for people in those regions to look around and see what they cannot achieve, cannot have, and know that it is an easier option.
Well, yes,
overpopulation.
It could be, but I think we need to actually look at the actual epidemiology of it. There are cases where that's it. Mostly it's not. It's the most trivial reasons people kill themselves. They feel that they've been insulted or something, that they lose their temper. I researched this for a paper I wrote about suicide and was blown away by the banality of suicide.
A lot of the time, substances are involved as well. Alcohol is a huge driver.
And weed killer, unfortunately, which is a particularly nasty form of death. That's the method by which they use. But suicide isn't difficult. People quite across the world quite commonly commit suicide not by hanging themselves, but by just putting a noose around their neck and leaning into it.
What do you think of Japan? And I know there's that area in Japan, it's where there's this forest and you're allowed to kill yourself. What are your thoughts on that?
I know it's obviously the culture of suicide in Japan is unusual in the sense that it's so much based on honor and loss of a job or loss of the ability to support your family or whatever can be a reason for people to think that they've been so shamed that they can't live with it any longer. again, it's not actually an altruistic act, because they're not helping anybody by, the fact that you're not an effective breadwinner doesn't mean you'll be a more effective one if you weren't there. But suicides across the world have a lot. They're a cultural phenomenon. People copy what others do, and amongst the Palawan, who live in a particular area of Micronesia, anthropologists wrote about it as a domino effect. I mean, people just, one does it and next does it and next does it. The most likely cause of suicide, which reach astonishing rates sometimes in villages there, is that somebody else amongst it, and you knew, one of your family did it. Most suicides are copycat suicides. And then on that Japanese mountain underneath Mount Fuji, it's the same. They're following the route that others have already taken, and it's. I suppose it's consoling to think that, and I'm not the first to be doing this. I think. Who knows how suicide ever got a grip to begin with in the human community, but once it had, I think it was a very dangerous meme. I've written about the meme of suicide, how catching it is.
From sentience to suicide, what got you? What sent you into that trajectory? I know Albert Camus says there is but one serious philosophical question, and that is whether life is worth living or not. And then he's obviously talking about suicide. What led you down that route?
Well, coming to suicide, it's a slightly different reason that I actually got involved with it. I organized a conference in San Diego with a wonderful organization called CARTA, Center for Research on Anthropogeny, and we decided to have it on human understanding of death, because it's such an important part of human culture and human thinking. And we thought we had to have somebody writing about the evolution of suicide. And we looked around the world, consulted this person and that. We couldn't find anybody to do it. So I said, okay, I'll take it on. So I started researching suicide. And that's how I came to actually giving a talk there and then writing a paper which was published in Proceedings of the Royal Society on that issue. But in the course of that, and things always, of course, come together, I realized that actually I think one of the best defenses against suicide is the realization that life is beautiful. And life is beautiful. And I think that at many points in our history, we just, in the most depressed state, we just had to walk out the door to appreciate this unbelievable bounty of nature, and at every level, from falling rain to smell of flowers to mountain peaks and whatever it is. And it's difficult in the face of that to say that life's not worthwhile. There's a lovely passage in a book called Lavengro, I don't even know, by George Borrow. It's about gypsies and about gypsy life in England as it was. And the author is quite partly autobiographical. He's been reading Granta, and he's thinking suicide is really rather romantic, and everybody has a duty to end their life. And he says to his gypsy friend, I don't see why anyone keeps going. And the friend says, well, because life is good. Why would you not? He says, well, it's not good. He says, well, there's the wind on the heath, brother. There's the sun and the moon and the stars. Knowing those, how could I want to end it?
But yeah, for me, my thing on that is that not everyone gets to experience such a blissful experience of life.
Well, no, they don't. But they do. I think. I think unless you're confined to a slum or whatever it may be, and even then, you can find beauty in nature and then beauty in sunsets and things. Fortunately, you don't have to go to a gallery. You don't have to money to appreciate so many of these things. It's there for the taking, and I think we're astonishingly lucky that, for reasons which have no obvious rationale, that nature is so beautiful. I once, John Brockman has a website in which he asks people to ask questions, and he had a final session a year or two ago, in which he always publishes them. What's your big question? And my question was, why is life so beautiful? And I didn't know the answer to it. I mean, I really do not quite understand why things like that have formed the patterns and the conjunctions and the contrasts which they do in ways which are just mind-blowing. I mean, you know, even silly things. Why are the sun and the moon exactly the same size? So they subtend the same arc exactly in the sky, so that when one crosses the other, you get a total eclipse. It can't be true anywhere else in the universe. I mean, this is a pure bit of luck. I mean, why do we deserve to be so lucky in that rather grand way, and in all the other ways which we are? And another thing which I think we need to know about humans, we think of ourselves as Homo sapiens. I mean, the cleverest of animals. We're also the most sensual of animals. We have the ones who have probably the most developed sensory qualia, I think, of any animal, but also the eye and the ear for the poetry of sensations. And I think we shouldn't be shy of admitting that, you know, we humans we're not just intellects. We are unbelievably into our bodies and our sounds and smells and the rest of it, in a way which, yeah, my dog's, I say, a qualiophile, but I don't think he's a patch on my daughter. You know, humans are made to love using and exploiting their sensory abilities, and it's been the making of us. I mean, I'm serious again. I think humans, it's part of the reason why we have souls, because our sensory experience is so rich. It was fed with these remarkable phenomena in ways which build us up with a sense of our own importance, which can't be there in most animals.
It almost reminds me of the existentialist movement with Jean-Paul Sartre and the way they perceive suicide. I know Albert Camus mentioned that there's physical suicide and philosophical suicide. One can either commit physical suicide or commit philosophical suicide by either taking a leap of faith, believing in God, telling you what to do, or perhaps a cultural movement, etc. Do you think that your innate love for the phenomenal experience of the universe is a sort of philosophical suicide at the expense of physical suicide?
Well, except I don't think I had to work at it. I mean, I don't think there's no system involved. You don't have to commit yourself to various axioms and things. It just, you know, it's there. And then wonderful thing about humans is that we're not actually all the same, and our experiences of the world are not the same. Do you know a philosopher called Tom Metzinger?
No. Thomas Metzinger.
Thomas Metzinger,
yes.
Yes. So, well, he's, having heard me give a lecture once, he said, Nick, I just can't believe you must have had such a happy life, because you were going on about how wonderful life is. I had an awful life. I think that phenomenal consciousness is a real burden. And Thomas has actually argued seriously that we actually have a moral duty not to have children. And we certainly have a moral duty not to make machines which are phenomenally conscious, but actually that if we are being utilitarian and want to reduce the amount of, maximize the amount of happiness and reduce the amount of harm and hurt in the world, we probably should actually reduce the number of human beings which are there to experience it.
There's actually an antinatalism, I think, formed at the UCT in South Africa. One of the professors actually made the theory of, I forgot his name.
I forget his name. I've met him. Yes, he's awful, but I agree. He's very clever.
Apparently, he always wears a hat.
Yes,
and tries to never be photographed at any point. But
yes,
he's very close to.
He's a poser and a show off. But some of his ideas are very intriguing, I have to say. What is
Thomas talks about? It's good. Thomas talks about the illusion of self, and he often takes this interpretation as far as he takes it into consciousness as well, and he proposes his own theories. I always, to round it off, I want to show you this picture in your book, Soul Searching, of yourself. I mean, that is how do you think what would you tell this version of Nick
I can't
regarding
remember which one that is.
views on consciousness back in these days.
Well, Kevin, yeah, I'm often surprised and embarrassed to read what I've written and see what I was. On the other hand, equally, sometimes I think, gosh, that was good, wasn't it? And I can't have written that. So I think we have this odd relationship to our past selves. And I'm just hoping that, that for the last nearly 80 years, it's been a work in progress. What I dread is coming to a point which I think, well, that's my last idea or my last book.
Do you feel more? Do you feel happy about the fact that your views have changed over time, or do you feel?
Oh yes, absolutely. No, I'm proud of that.
Yeah, because I agree. I think that's a very good sign that somebody is growing and learning and taking into account that they have certain biases at certain points in their life. I mean, I often viewed consciousness as an emergent property. Emergentism was my fundamental view of it.
A kind of physical emergentism.
Yes. I just assumed at some point level of complexity, once you move off in certain orders from physics to biology to physiology, psychology will suddenly emerge this conscious property. Just kind of like they often use the example of drops of H2O. I mean, singular H2O molecules don't give you this wetness. Once you put it together, you have wetness. And then in my early 20s,
I agree.
So I know
I've been that too, and I agree.
It became a very much more aligned to Dennett's work, your work, etc.
But in a sense, emergentism is coming back with integrated information theory.
Yeah.
And you just need to have more of the same, and you suddenly reach a level of phi which becomes self-conscious and in fact it starts experiencing qualia. I shouldn't threaten you by sending. I've been writing a bit about this in the new book, and when you have chance to have a holiday, I'll send it to you, but I shouldn't burn whether it's on you now. Where are you going with these programs? These are, this is a very ambitious set of podcasts, isn't it? Seriously, Tiffin, where are you going with it? And will you publish it somehow? Or, at the moment, it'll be distributed in South Africa, but that's, of course,
the goal. In South Africa, I used to host two of South Africa's most popular Asian lifestyle television shows. So I retired many years ago, left social media for a while, decided to continue with my passion for neuroscience, psychology, etc. When I was younger, I wanted to be an astrophysicist. I wanted to study physical cosmology. I wanted to know what is the origin of everything. That slowly changed into the mind, trying to figure out. I figured it's going to be pretty much impossible to go beyond the universe itself. Let me rather look within. So this has been something that's always plagued my own mind, and I've always wanted to know the answer to how this has come to be. How have these species arrived at conscious experiences? And it's funny you were mentioning phi. I've got a tattoo. I've got phi and psi there. So it's for psychology and philosophy, and that's the logo of my podcast. If you look at the logo, it's actually a brain with phi and psi inside it, because I think we've got to take all these different fields of research, whether it's psychology, anthropology, linguistics, artificial intelligence, etc. I think the only way to find the answer is to look at each level of knowledge, even if you have to take theology, art, poetry, all of it. It's all important and vital information. So the goal is it's not really to conquer the mind-body problem, but rather to learn more about it.
And will you write a book yourself?
The thought comes and goes. I've written an essay on consciousness at the moment. I've sent it to Keith, Mark Solms as well, my professor here in Cape Town. So they've all taken a look at it, really loved it. It's mostly aligned to illusionism. For me, I think of it as, I prefer to call a spade a spade. I think that it's amazing that we've evolved these tricks of the mind. I think the fact that we even feel the way we feel is genuinely amazing. But ideally, when I look at the way reality actually works and our sensory limitations, my own view is that it's impossible for us to ever make the correct conclusions based on the sensory limitations that we have. We're always going to have some sort of perceptual distortion. So for me, it's so difficult to believe that we have these essence-like properties. And I think it also stems from this materialistic view that I've grown up with, being a non-religious, loving mathematics and physics, wanting to study physical cosmology. I think it all adds up at some point, my bias towards this. But yeah.
Yeah, but I'm a bit sad if at the end of it all, what you're learning is limitations rather than the possibilities. I think you should, that you're going to be in a rather strong position, probably more than anyone else I know, not to see where the barriers are, but to see possibly the path through them, because you're going to have talked to a lot of people who have got stuck, and at the same time, but they're stuck on their own bit of it.
But as I said,
anyway, when you're not going to have a PhD and a medical degree and a television BAFTA or something like that as well. So, be careful what you do next.
Yeah, no, look, ideally, my hope is that the more I speak to people like you and everyone else, I'm just going to speak to Philip, going to speak to everyone, I would actually hope that my views change, and that is the goal. It's not for me to try and push my framework and my way of thinking onto others. The main quest of this is to try and understand everyone else's perspective and see how I can add to it. So for me, I'm not 100% convinced on my own thoughts either.
There's one of the best of these interview blog things which was done was called Closer to the Truth. Do you know that?
With Robert Lawrence Kuhn.
Yeah, I thought he did that beautifully. But what's also very good is the way he's edited it afterwards, taken issues and then fixed, brought together different views coming from his interviews on those particular issues. So it's an awful lot of work. I think he must have a huge editorial team.
I'm pretty sure, yeah. It is a lot of work. Coming from a TV background, I know how much work goes into editing. Podcasting is a lot easier, I would say.
Yeah. Okay. Well, it's lovely talking to you, and keep me in. Well, will you send a copy of, or tell me when these things begin to appear?
No, definitely. I'll certainly do so. Nick, thank you so much for chatting to me. It's been an absolute pleasure. I've been looking forward to chatting to you for such a long time. And look, I don't want you to leave this conversation thinking that I'm seeing all of this as limitations, because I do not. I am deeply
I know you don't.
Inspired by the fact that we've evolved these traits and the ability to perceive reality. I mean, I often think about, not in a metaphysical way, but the fact that we are sensory organs of this universe. We are a way for this universe to know itself, understand itself. It's amazing to have these abilities, but
just come back on this question of limitations. Lots of people have said in one way or another that without limitations, we're lost. People have talked about how much the importance of verse, the importance of writing verse is that you have structure within which you are writing your sonnet or whatever it is. And you would never have got round to putting it this way if you hadn't had that structure. It works at every level. I mean, Lenin said, freedom is the recognition of necessity. And without, if you're too free, so if you have no bounds on you, you're not free at all. So,
yeah, I completely, I think that's a great way to conclude. Nick, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. I hope we get to chat again sometime, hopefully after your next book is out. And I'll definitely be sending you a copy of this.
Thank you so much. It was a real pleasure.